some decisions in life don't come with a warning. They sneak up on you like shadows in the night. Before you know it, you're questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how I stepped into the gray areas of morality. Led by love, desperation, and eventually, something I never expected. It was a quiet evening in our suburban Connecticut home. The kind where the silence between David and me stretched longer than our conversations. We had been married for 10 years, and though I loved him, something had shifted over time. We went from holding hands in crowded rooms to barely brushing against each other in the same bed. That night, the air felt different. David seemed tense, his forehead lined with worry as he sipped his whiskey. His eyes were fixed on the hardwood floor I'd insisted on installing last spring. "Sarah," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Yes." I put down the book I'd been pretending to read and looked at him. "I need to talk to you about something important." I nodded, my chest tightening. Conversations that started this way rarely led to anything good. "My business," he began, then paused, exhaling heavily. "It's in trouble. Real trouble." I frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" "You've never mentioned." "I didn't want to worry you," he interrupted, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "But things have been bad for months, and now we're on the brink of bankruptcy. If something doesn't change soon, we could lose everything." I was stunned. David had always been the stable one, the provider. He never shared his struggles, and now he was dropping this bombshell. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice laced with frustration and fear. "I didn't want you to worry," he repeated, his tone softer now. "But there's someone who could help." "Who?" "James Cooper." The name was familiar. James was a wealthy businessman, the kind who made headlines for his success and charm. He was everything David wasn't: bold, magnetic, and intimidating. "What does he have to do with this?" David hesitated, and for the first time in years, I saw shame flicker across his face. "He's interested in me pitching my business to him, but..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "But what, David?" "He's also interested in you." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "What?" "He mentioned you during one of our conversations. He's seen pictures of us at the charity gala last month. He thinks you're beautiful. He said he'd be more open to helping me if..." David trailed off again, unable to finish the sentence. The room felt like it was spinning. "Are you asking me to?" "No," David said quickly, his voice rising. "I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do." But he hinted that having you around, showing some interest, could him more willing to invest. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. My husband, the man I trusted, was asking me to flirt, no, to seduce another man for the sake of his business. "This is insane, David. How could you even suggest?" "I don't know what else to do," he snapped, his desperation bubbling to the surface. "I've tried everything, Sarah. Everything. This is my last chance. Our last chance. I'm not asking you to sleep with him. Just make him believe you're interested. Make him think there's something worth investing in." His words hit me like a slap. "Do you hear yourself? You're asking your wife to lie, to manipulate someone." David's face crumpled, and for the first time in years, I saw tears in his eyes. "I know. I know how awful this is, but I'm out of options. Please, Sarah. Just meet him. That's all I'm asking." I wanted to say no, to throw his ridiculous idea back in his face. But as I looked at him, at the man I'd vowed to love and support, I felt my resolve weaken. I thought about the life we'd built, the sacrifices we'd made, the possibility of losing it all. Just one meeting? I asked quietly. David nodded. Just one. If you're uncomfortable, I'll drop it. I promise. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Fine. I'll meet him. The relief on David's face was immediate, but it did nothing to ease the knot in my stomach. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line I could never uncross. The days leading up to the meeting were a blur of anxiety and second-guessing. David arranged everything: a dinner reservation at an upscale steakhouse in Manhattan, a new dress, and even a brief rundown of James's interests. The night of the meeting, I stood in front of my mirror, adjusting the black dress David had bought for me. It hugged my curves in a way that felt both flattering and foreign. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. "You look beautiful," David said from the doorway, his voice soft. I turned to him, searching his face for some sign of guilt or hesitation. But all I saw was gratitude. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As I walked out the door, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end, or the start of something I couldn't yet understand. The drive into Manhattan was silent. David had offered to come with me, but I refused. I needed to do this alone. The steakhouse was exactly what you'd expect: all dark wood, leather booths, and soft lighting. The kind of place where deals were made and secrets were kept. When I arrived, James was already there. He stood as I approached, and my heart skipped a beat. The photos I'd seen didn't do him justice. Tall, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, he commanded attention without trying. His tailored suit probably cost more than my car. "Sarah," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Pleasure is mine," I replied, forcing a smile. As we sat down, I couldn't help but notice how easily he commanded attention. His tailored suit, his easy smile, it was no wonder he was so successful. Over the course of dinner, we talked about everything: art, travel, business. He was charming, attentive, and disarmingly honest. For a moment, I forgot why I was there. I forgot about David and the weight of his request. When the waiter cleared our plates, James leaned in slightly. His eyes locked onto mine. "You're an incredible woman, Sarah. David is a lucky man." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to respond, to deflect, but my mind was spinning. By the time the evening ended, I felt like I was walking a tightrope, teetering between loyalty and something far more dangerous. As James kissed my hand and said goodbye, I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. I didn't tell David much about the dinner when I got home that night. His questions were expected: how was it? What did you talk about? Did he seem interested in the business? But my answers were clipped and vague. I told him James was polite and charming, that we had a pleasant conversation, that he seemed open to hearing David's business proposal. But the truth was far more complicated. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about James. His commanding voice. The way his eyes lingered just a second too long when he looked at me. How his words made me feel seen, heard, even admired in a way I hadn't felt in years. I tried to shake the thoughts, to bury them under the weight of my everyday life. But no matter how hard I tried, they kept resurfacing, like a song stuck on repeat. So when James called me later that week, I wasn't surprised. What surprised me was how quickly I agreed to meet him again. The second meeting was different. This time, we met at a rooftop bar in Manhattan. It was quieter, more intimate. The kind of place where conversations could stretch into the night without interruption. James was already there when I arrived. Seated in a leather armchair with a glass of scotch in his hand. He stood when he saw me, his smile warm and inviting. "Sarah," he said, his voice like silk. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." "I wasn't sure I should," I admitted, taking the seat across from him. "I'm glad you did." There was something about the way he said it. The way his eyes met mine that made my stomach flutter. The conversation started innocently enough. We talked about David's business. About James's investments. About life in the suburbs versus life in the city. But as the night wore on, the tone began to shift. "You know," James said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You're not what I expected." "Oh." I raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" He leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying me. "Someone more predictable. Polished, maybe. But you're different. There's something about you that feels real. Honest." I laughed, a soft, nervous sound. Honest isn't a word I'd use to describe myself these days. He tilted his head, intrigued. "Why not?" "Let's just say I'm not here because I want to be," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. James's gaze softened. "Does that mean you're here for him? For David?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "He thinks you can save his business. And I guess he thinks I can convince you to try." James didn't respond right away. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set his glass down and leaned forward. His elbows resting on his knees. "And what do you think, Sarah?" The question caught me off guard. What do I think about what? About all of this. About being here. About me. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. The truth was messy, tangled up in emotions I didn't fully understand. "I think," I began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I think you're different than I expected too. And I think this, whatever this is more complicated than I thought it would be." James smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips. "Complicated can be interesting." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I felt a rush of heat rise to my cheeks and quickly looked away. Focusing on the city lights twinkling beyond the rooftop. "I should go," I said abruptly, standing up. "Sarah." "Thank you for the drink," I said, cutting him off. "But I can't do this." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked toward the elevator. My heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James's face. Heard his voice. Felt the pull of his presence. By the time morning came, I was a mess of conflicting emotions. Guilt, shame, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. David noticed my mood but didn't press me about it. He was too preoccupied with his own worries to pay much attention to mine. "You've done enough," he said when I mentioned the dinner and the follow-up meeting. "If James is interested, he'll reach out. If not, then, well, we'll figure something out." But James did reach out. And despite every rational thought telling me not to, I found myself agreeing to see him again. And again. And again. Each time, the line between right and wrong became more blurred. Each time, I told myself it would be the last. Each time, I lied. The third meeting wasn't planned. It was a coincidence, or at least that's what I told myself. I was running errands in Manhattan when I spotted him. James was outside a small cafe, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I passed, and our eyes met. For a moment, I considered walking away, pretending I hadn't seen him. But something stopped me. "Sarah," he called, smiling as he waved me over. "What are the odds?" I hesitated, then approached him, my heart racing. Beneath my casual exterior. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to sound natural. "Coffee," he said, holding up his cup. "And now, apparently, running into you." I laughed despite myself. And before I knew it, I was sitting across from him, a cup of coffee warming my hands. The conversation flowed easily, effortlessly. Like we were old friends instead of near strangers. As the minutes turned into hours, I felt myself letting go. Of the tension. Of the guilt. Of the constant questioning. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. But freedom, I would soon learn, always comes at a price. The first time it happened, it was as if I stepped outside of myself. James had invited me to his penthouse suite, under the guise of discussing David's business proposal. He made it sound so formal, so professional, that I convinced myself it was innocent. But when I stepped into that room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Central Park, I knew this was no ordinary business meeting. "Wine?" James offered, holding up a bottle of red. I hesitated but nodded, my pulse quickening as he poured 2 glasses. Handed one to me. "David's proposal is solid," he said, his tone casual, as he leaned against the marble counter. "He's done his homework. I think there's potential." "That's good to hear," I said, taking a sip of wine. The warmth of it spread through me, loosening the tension in my shoulders. "But enough about business," James continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "I didn't ask you here to talk about spreadsheets." I froze, my heart pounding. "Then why did you ask me here?" He set his glass down and took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone. "Because I can't stop thinking about you, Sarah. And I don't think you can stop thinking about me either." The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with unspoken possibilities. I opened my mouth to protest, to deny his words. But nothing came out. Because he was right. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering against my cheek. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. I didn't. The affair was like stepping into a parallel universe. With James, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. He was attentive, passionate, endlessly curious about my thoughts, my dreams. The parts of myself I'd buried beneath the roles of wife and homemaker. Our encounters were stolen moments, carefully planned and executed with the precision of a heist. A midday rendezvous at his penthouse. A weekend trip to Boston under the pretense of visiting an old friend. Late-night phone calls where his voice was the last thing I heard before drifting to sleep. Every time I saw him, I told myself it would be the last. And every time, I found myself going back. At home, the guilt was suffocating. David noticed the change in me. But he misread it entirely. "You seem happier lately," he said one evening, as we sat on the couch, a TV show playing in the background. "Happier?" I echoed, my stomach twisting. Yeah, I don't know. Lighter, maybe. Whatever it is, I'm glad. He smiled, his hand resting on mine. I forced a smile in return, hating myself for the lie I was living. James, on the other hand, seemed unbothered by the morality of it all. Life is too short to deny yourself happiness, he told me one night. As we lay tangled in his sheets, the city lights casting a soft glow across the room. But this, what we're doing, it's wrong, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Wrong? He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me. How can something that feels this good be wrong? I didn't have an answer. The weeks turned into months, and the affair became both my escape and my prison. With James, I felt free. Free to be the version of myself I'd forgotten existed. But the guilt of betraying David, of living a double life, gnawed at me constantly. I found myself overcompensating at home, throwing myself into being the perfect wife. I cooked elaborate dinners, planned date nights, laughed at jokes that weren't funny. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that David knew. One night, as we sat in bed reading, he set his book down and looked at me. Sarah, he began, his tone serious. Yes? Are you happy? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? In our marriage, he clarified. Are you happy? I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Of course I am. Why would you ask that? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. You just seem different lately. Like you're somewhere else. I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. That's ridiculous. I'm fine, David. Really? He didn't look convinced. But he let it go. As the affair deepened, so did my feelings for James. I knew I was playing with fire. That I was risking everything for a man who wasn't mine to keep. But I couldn't bring myself to stop. Until the night everything fell apart. It was late when I got home. My hair still smelling faintly of James's cologne. I tried to slip into bed without waking David. But he stirred, his voice groggy. Where were you? Out, I lied, my voice steady. With a friend. He turned to look at me. His eyes sharp despite the darkness. Which friend? The question caught me off guard. And I stumbled over my answer. Ah. Karen from book club. David was silent for a moment. And I could feel the weight of his gaze. Sarah, he said finally. His voice low and steady. Are you seeing someone else? My heart stopped. No, I said quickly. Too quickly. Don't lie to me, he said, his tone colder now. I know something's going on. I've known for weeks. The room was suffocating. The walls closing in around me. David, Don't, he interrupted, his voice breaking. Just don't. For the first time, I saw the cracks in the man I thought was unshakable. And in that moment, I realized the full cost of what I'd done. I had betrayed him. And there was no going back. David didn't yell. He didn't lash out or accuse me of anything. Instead, his quiet, broken voice cut deeper than any rage ever could. Who is he? He asked. His eyes fixed on the ceiling as if he couldn't bear to look at me. It's not what you think, I began. But the words sounded hollow even to me. Don't lie to me, Sarah, his tone was firm, his jaw clenched. You owe me that much. I sat there frozen. Every excuse I'd rehearsed crumbling under the weight of his stare. His name is James, I finally admitted. My voice barely above a whisper. David inhaled sharply. As if the name itself had wounded him. For a long moment, he said nothing. And I wondered if he was waiting for me to say more. Or if he was too stunned to speak. How long? He asked at last. David, please. How long? He repeated, his voice rising for the first time. 2 months, I confessed. The words spilling out like poison. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. 2 months. Jesus. I never meant for this to happen, I said. Tears streaming down my face. I didn't plan any of it. I was trying to help you, to help us. To help us? His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. By sleeping with another man? I didn't sleep with him at first, I blurted out. Instantly regretting the words. They sounded pathetic. Like a child trying to justify a broken rule. At first, he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. And then what, Sarah? You just couldn't resist? I buried my face in my hands. Unable to meet his gaze. I'm sorry, I whispered. Sorry? David stood up, pacing the room. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed everything. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to defend myself. To explain the loneliness I'd felt. The way James had filled a void I hadn't even realized existed. But how could I justify the unjustifiable? The days that followed were a blur of silence and avoidance. David moved into the guest bedroom. And barely spoke to me. When he did, it was cold, detached. As if he were speaking to a stranger. I tried to reach out to him. To bridge the growing chasm between us. But every attempt was met with indifference or anger. I just need time, he said one morning. His voice flat. Time for what? To forgive me? To decide if he wanted to stay? I didn't ask. I was too afraid of the answer. And then there was James. I didn't tell him about the confrontation with David. But he must have sensed something was wrong. You've been distant, he said one afternoon. When I met him at his penthouse. I've been dealing with some things, I replied. Avoiding his gaze. Things? He raised an eyebrow. His tone laced with skepticism. It's complicated, I said, my voice trembling. James sighed, setting his glass of whiskey down on the table. You know, Sarah, I didn't get involved with you to be part of some messy love triangle. His words stung. But they also revealed the truth I'd been trying to ignore. To James, I was a thrill. A diversion. Whatever connection we had wasn't built to last. I think we need to end this, I said. My voice firm despite the ache in my chest. He looked at me for a long moment. His expression unreadable. Then he nodded. If that's what you want. It is, I said. Though the words felt like sandpaper against my throat. I left his penthouse for the last time. The weight of my choices pressing down on me with every step. At home, things didn't improve. If anything, the distance between David and me grew wider. He threw himself into his work. Leaving early and coming home late. I spent my days wandering the house. Haunted by memories of what we once had. And the reality of what I'd destroyed. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, David walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. I spoke to James today, he said. His voice calm but strained. My heart stopped. You what? He called me, David continued. His eyes fixed on the floor. Said he wanted to move forward with the investment. I didn't know how to respond. What did you say? I said no. David, you. I don't want his money, he interrupted. His voice rising. Not like this. Not because of what you did. I stood there, stunned, as his words sank in. I'd rather lose everything than let him have any part of our lives, David said. His voice breaking. Tears welled in my eyes as I reached out to him. David, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. He stepped back, shaking his head. It's not just about me, Sarah. It's about us. And I don't know if there's anything left to save. That night, as I lay in bed alone, I realized the full extent of what I'd done. I hadn't just betrayed David. I'd betrayed myself, my values, and the life we'd built together. I didn't know if we could ever rebuild what I'd broken. But I knew one thing for certain. The road ahead would be long and uncertain. And it would require more honesty and vulnerability than I'd ever given before. The next morning, I made a decision. I would fight for my marriage. For David. For the life we dreamed of. Even if it meant facing the darkest parts of myself. And owning up to my mistakes. Because love, I realized, isn't about perfection. It's about perseverance. And if there was even a sliver of hope left, I was determined to find it. Even if it meant starting from scratch. End.